Hello YouTubers, welcome to another edition of AP Vocabulary. We're focusing on Asia during the Cold War, and specifically in this video on the Pacific Rim countries of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and we'll look at Hong Kong as well. And we're going to kind of not talk about China, communist China in this video, because we want to focus on kind of the democratized and westernized nations of the Pacific Rim that were rebuilding economically after World War II. So let's start first with what the Pacific Rim countries are, or were, or still are, and what the Pacific Rim is, so that way we can get kind of a better idea of what we're talking about here. First of all, the Pacific Rim is just all land that borders the Pacific Ocean, and in Asia that includes many nations along the Pacific Rim that became highly developed industrial powerhouses and economic powerhouses after World War II, including Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, and they became very prosperous industrial nations after World War II. So let's look first at Japan post-World War II before we kind of move into the other ones. So first of all, Japan after World War II adopted multiple Western reforms and started to become more like the West in a lot of ways. First of all, and most of it is because the United States occupied Japan directly after the war and kind of forced them to do some of these things. So they were mostly democratic changes to government, which were modeled after the Western liberal democracies. So women voting, gender equality, labor unions were brought in, economic reform, a new constitution, the emperor being put kind of still as a leader in Japan, but not as an actual political leader, as a figurehead leader, and Shintoism's role in Japan's society strictly, well, not eliminated, but relegated to something that was back burner, and reforms to education to promote trying to promote less of a nationalistic education and more of a Western mindset of education. So these reforms were adopted by Japan, and really Japan was able to quickly grow economically after World War II because of a number of things. So how did they grow economically? What reasons did they experience economic growth? The very first one was because of their reduced money spent on military. The United States basically took over their military for them and took care of defense and set up bases in Japan. So as a trade-off for having American bases in Japan, the Japanese were able to spend a lot more money on economic growth. So more money was freed up from military spending to spend on industrial goals, leading to a very strong economy. They also had close government and business cooperation, leading to the nickname of Japan Incorporated. It was almost like all of Japan was one big business. So in contrast to the United States, where economic competition was the norm, Japan, though having a democracy and on the surface a free market capitalistic society, they really were kind of promoting their national interests with business at the same time. So they led the way with automobiles and electronics, and not only because they produced a lot of them, but because they produced very good automobiles and electronics. So Toyotas and Mitsubishis and Hondas, these are good cars, and electronics. Sony probably being the most well-known Japanese electronics company that come out of this time period. But Japan still has a reputation for creating some very high-end electronics, not just lots of cheap ones, very good electronics. The other thing that they did was they promoted more education and more engineers and science and business-related jobs, and spent less time spent less time kind of arguing for labor rights and more time being devoted to their businesses as though it was devoting to their nation. So high levels of work ethic in Japan led to high levels of stress and some bouts with alcoholism, but this became kind of a normal thing as Japan progressed, even though a lot of their workers were definitely very stressed out and still continue to be stressed out. They have a very hard work ethic, and they work hard. So American culture did permeate into Japanese society in some ways, mainly with recreation, sports, some stuff, leisure time activities. The Japanese adopted baseball, tennis, golf, these Western kind of sports and leisure activities, but retained a distinct Japanese identity with these things. American baseball and Japanese baseball are totally different. If you ever watch the World Baseball Classic, it's interesting to see the Japanese mindset with baseball as much more of a team unity and a national pride aspect of it. Whereas it seems as if in American sports there's a lot of independent glory, individual glory. The team is kind of the focus in Japanese sports, so it's kind of a microcosm for Japanese society. Okay, so what other nations were there along the Pacific Rim? The first one I wanted to look at was Korea, and Korea was divided in the Korean War between North and South Korea. So the North was controlled by the Soviets, and Kim Il-sung became the communist leader in North Korea and remained the communist leader until the 1990s. The United States backed a democratic South Korea, and so when the North tried to attack into the South to unite all of Korea, the U.S. responded by backing up the South and pushing the North Koreans back to the North. After 3 years, by 1953, there was a stalemate, and they signed an armistice, halting the war but not ending the war. So North and South Korea are still very much keeping an eye on one another, and it remains Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea. So South Korea was able to also rely, just like Japan, on heavy cooperation between government and industry. They had the United States backing them up militarily, so they didn't have to worry about spending a lot of money on military. They had some huge firms which grew very powerful, industrial firms, led to economic advances in the country, and they competed in the same areas as Japan did with cars and electronics. And so a lot of South Korean car companies and electronics are also very high-end products. An example is Hyundai, or Hyundai, which a lot of Americans call it, was such a powerful firm that it almost acted as a governing body for the people who worked for it. It provided low housing costs, decent wages, and demanded loyalty from its people, who were given some vacation every year, but for the most part people were very devoted to the company because it stood for their country as well. So what about some other places? So along the Pacific Rim, Taiwan was a small island nation that kind of broke away from China after the communists took over. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists moved out to the island of Taiwan. There were some early battles and tensions between Taiwan and China. For the most part, China was okay with allowing the Taiwanese government to operate on its own. It was known as the Republic of China, the ROC in Taiwan, while Communist China was known as the People's Republic of China, so the PRC. So these two have kind of ever since operated independently of one another, but China still claims Taiwan as a province. Taiwan claims independence. Most of the world recognizes Taiwan as a part of China, though operating independently in a political and economic atmosphere. Very rapid economic advances because of their relationship to the West in Taiwan. Hong Kong is another interesting example of China that's not really China. Hong Kong was a British port, a British colony ever since the Opium War. It remained in British hands until the 1990s. 1997 is when it officially went back to China. People were known to leave mainland China, to kind of leave communism and be on the more free small island of Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong is a tiny, heavily populated, massively kind of industrialized, a center for banking and an important port city off of China's coast. and has maintained a certain degree, even after returning to China, a great degree of freedom from the Chinese government, the Communist Party. Singapore was another example of an area that used to be a colony of Britain and became an independent country. It was an important shipping and naval base at the end of the south end of the Malay Peninsula. It became an independent country in 1965 and was a very busy port still, and maintained heavy economic growth, rapid economic development, despite the fact that it was kind of a heavily authoritarian country. And the idea is it's a very tiny place, and so strict rules to govern a huge population in a tiny place were needed. So it's part of the emerging Pacific Rim nations. And the reason these Pacific Rim nations were able to get economically powerful was in a large part because of their reliance on Western means instead of communist means of production and economy. So there's our first video. I'll come back with a talk about China, and then we'll talk about Vietnam as well. So be awesome.